Welcome to the Astro Guy podcast. I'm not an expert, I'm an amateur like you. I'm here to learn and here to teach. So let's enjoy the ride together. Carpe Noctem, seize the night. I'm your host, Wayne Zool, and this is the Astro Guy podcast. In this episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Silvana Della from silvanaphotos.com. Silvana is a lifelong hobbyist as far as astronomy goes and photography, and she specializes in nightscape photography. Her images are just stunning to look at. So I hope that you'll enjoy this episode. In it, we dive into how she got into the hobby. We talk about gear, we talk about some of the processes, different utilities that she uses. So I think it's really a great episode. We had a lot of fun, and the imagery is just fantastic. So sit back and enjoy. I know I did, and I'm sure that you will as well. On this episode, we have a very special guest. We have Silvana Della from Silvana Photography. Is it Silvana Della Photography or
Della Camera.
Della
That's
Camera?
yeah.
Okay. And what's the website?
It's to keep it you know, less Rosanna Dana like. I just kept it with my first name and photo. So silvanaphoto.com.
Okay, and the website's awesome. You can go on there and see lots of some of the great work Silvana's done. She's an amazing photographer that specializes in I'm going to call it nightscapes. As far as the astronomy side of things go, and I know you do other things with your photography as well. And before we dive into things, your background is extremely cool. And what I'd like to do is if you can just tell me a little bit about what that is, because I saw something very similar a couple of weeks ago when I was out imaging, and I'd like to get your perspective on it.
Well, as you noted, I am a nightscape photographer primarily. And this particular night, I was in Jamestown, Rhode Island, to photograph. I was actually setting up to photograph the Beavertail Lighthouse and the Milky Way. And as I was setting up, I was, just getting my settings right and waiting for the sky to get dark. I noticed this white light coming up from the southern horizon and had no idea what it was. I often don't pay attention to the news. And I said, okay, I don't know what this is. It's getting brighter and brighter, but I'm going to capture it. So I set my camera on interval shooting, and I got a bunch of frames of the what it turned out to be the Falcon 9 SpaceX rocket. And this is the last frame that I got right before the rocket left my frame, the actual framing of the image. So I had no idea what it was until I got home and discovered it was the Falcon 9, which turned out to be my favorite shot of the night. I did get the Milky Way after it disappeared, but I was pretty shocked that I got this.
Yeah, it was a very cool sight to see, and I was surprised at how quickly it went by. I've seen a few other rockets from my house in New Jersey, but it was the first time I've seen a Falcon. A lot of the times we get to see them when they launch from Virginia at Wallops. Occasionally we'll see the sounding rockets, and that's kind of fun. But this was cruising at a bit faster speed than those rockets do, at least at that stage where it was. So for me, it was very cool to see. And what I did was I snapped a real quick picture with my cell phone, which you'll see in a second. But I put it out on Facebook, and within about 10 minutes, I had the answer of what it was. Now, I knew it wasn't anything, ridiculous, but I figured that there was a rocket I didn't know about, and sure enough, that's what it was. So, one of the things I always do with these interviews before we really dive into the meat of what you do, I try to get a little bit of background. So I want to know about how you first got interested in astronomy and then into photography as well.
Well, both have been a lifelong love for me. Astronomy, um, pretty much started when I was a little kid, 5 or 6 years old. And I remember distinctly playing with my friends, nighttime, lying on the grass, and we would stare up at the sky, and you'd see meteors. Now, I grew up in Boston, in one of the neighborhoods, and at that time you could see the skies pretty well, even though you were in a city. You could still see the stars pretty clearly. So seeing the meteors zooming by, and you know it was enchanting to a little kid. And I was a big fan of Star Trek, still am a huge fan of Star Trek. And seeing how they rendered space, it was so lifelike. You have the black space with these planets and nebula, and it was just fantastic to me. And that really sparked the love and fascination of astronomy. And for photography, I actually started earlier than that. I was probably a toddler when I discovered the viewfinder on my dad's camera. And he used to walk me around, holding me and the camera because it was so heavy to me at the time. And he'd walk me around as I was looking through the viewfinder. And I was totally entranced by the fact that this thing could block out like a specific area of my viewpoint. And that was it. At the age of 6, my dad got me my own camera, so he got me away from his because I was always like swiping it. And then when I was 14, he got me a 35 millimeter camera, which really taught me light and how it affects your images and how do you control it. And as I got older, the two of them merged. I love photography and I love astronomy. And I spent years trying to photograph the night skies with film, and it just didn't cut it. And once digital imaging came around, that's when it was like, aha, I can capture the magnificence of the night sky, and I never looked back.
That's it's funny. My story is kind of similar, at least on the photography end. My father had a passing interest in photography. When he was in World War II, he actually, uh, took pictures and developed them himself. And I remember having some of that equipment in the house. But when I was in high school, um, my favorite teacher was my photography teacher. And I joined the photography club. I just got into it, and I took the classes and learned all about using the camera and the lenses and the darkroom. And we were working with Pentax K1000 cameras, 35 millimeter cameras and black and white film. And it was a blast. I mean, I had a really good time with it. But you're right. I tried to do some uh, deep sky photography with it. I actually have a couple of pictures hanging in my office here of that I took through a 5-inch refractor back in the early 1990s, I think. In 1991, or 1992, I'm looking at them right now. They're on my wall. And they're open clusters, nothing fancy, and I think they're maybe 5-minute exposures. Anything longer than that, and it would have trailed. And this was a scope that was mounted on a large, permanently mounted scope. So it was very easy to guiding wasn't a major issue as long as you were pretty wide field, which this 5-inch refractor was. But you're right, I got away from it for a long time, and it was the pandemic is what got me back into it when I saw the changes in technology and what you can do with just a regular DSLR, or even better yet, a one-shot. In my case, a one-shot color astronomy camera. It's just amazing how the technology has changed it. So that was the big thing for me. So I understand exactly where you're coming from, and that took me a long way to get there, didn't it? So I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to guess your favorite thing to image is the Milky Way. Is that correct?
Yes, I love capturing the Milky Way. Not only because it's beautiful and to our eye, it's so faint, and even in the dark darkest parts of the world, it's still faint to us because we have very pathetic vision at night and we can't see it. We have a monochrome vision. So to us, it looks, pretty black and white. We can see some color of the stars, but pretty much it's a monochromatic world. Well, digital cameras, can really illustrate the reality of the night sky. The night is so colorful, and I like creating astro landscapes, meaning combining terrestrial foregrounds with the night sky. Because I think humans have this mentality where it's just the sun and the moon and nothing in between, and it's kind of like rattles the psyche of a viewer of my images to say, hey, there's much more than the sun and the moon dancing with the earth at night. It's a whole universe and then some. So that's one of the things that drives me to photograph astro landscape images, and Milky Way is my love. It really is.
So, with what you do, to me, those the photography landscapes that have, the landscape astrophotography has so many interesting things about it because you're capturing not just the night sky, which is stunning, but you're capturing these beautiful landscapes as well. Like behind you, you have the lighthouse, and to see it in that light that's naturally lit up by the night sky over a period of time is just, it boggles my mind because it's so beautiful. You've seen over time. They're one of my favorite images. It's a Milky Way image over someplace out west. I don't even know where it is, but it's a desert scene, and there's these red rocks, and they're lit up. I guess there was a moon, or maybe even the photographer used a flashlight to illuminate them, which is a great trick. But uh, it's just so cool to see a picture like that. And I think there's a tremendous amount of planning that goes into that, correct?
There is. There's a lot of planning that goes into each frame. You have to take into account how much light pollution is in the area. So you have to check the Bortle classification right from the start. Then you have to look at the weather, the cloud forecast, the location itself. Are you able to access it? What lights exist that could potentially impact your image, where the Milky Way is rising, or if you're shooting the moon, where is the moon rising? There's a lot of factors that come into play, and it's a juggling act. And sometimes you get lucky that all the stars align, no pun intended, and you end up with something that, knocks your socks off when you pull the images off your camera.
I think that that's one of the reasons I don't do that type of photography because the planet, I mean, obviously any kind of deep sky imaging, there's a lot of planning involved. But I think when you're dealing with not just what you're looking at in the sky, but also what you're looking at on the ground, that kind of really complicates things. But when you can master it like you've done, it's really a tremendous form of art, and it's really beautiful. And I'm going to urge people to go to your website, silvanaphoto.com, and look at some of your things. They can buy prints. There's just some beautiful, beautiful things on there.
Thank you.
All right. So I know one of the other questions I typically ask is what other science interests do you have? I know astronomy is a big passion, but
I love all science. I've been fascinated with sciences my entire life. I wanted to be a veterinarian. I went to college for 2 years, and studied biology, and then realization hit that if I didn't get into veterinary medical school, which is very difficult to get into, I didn't want to be in a lab. So then I switched over to math, figuring that was the language of the universe and I could apply it to anything. So long-winded story is I have like a wide breadth of loves, but astronomy is probably my strongest. And I really love learning about the history, the giants of the people that brought us to where we are with our knowledge, like Galileo and Copernicus and Kepler. I love that period of time, even going back to the ancients and knowing and learning what they knew and learned and passed along, through these centuries. It's just mind-boggling and so fascinating to read.
One of my favorite memories is I got to go to the Naval Observatory with some friends. This is about 20, more than 20 years ago, about 25 years ago. And I knew at the time, I knew the historian at the Naval Observatory, and we got a private tour. And if you've ever seen the Naval Observatory in Washington, there's the main building, and then there's a dome on one side, and there's a round room on the other. And that round room is the largest astronomy library in the world.
Wow.
And it's just stacks and stacks of astronomy books. But the great part of the tour was he took us into the rare book vault, and in there, wearing gloves, we got to hold, uh, a first edition copy of Principia.
Oh my God.
There were books. I forget what the book was, but there was handwritten notes in the margins, and they said they think that the notes are actually from Galileo.
Oh, I
So
get
it was,
chills.
oh, it was such a cool thing. So another thing in this hobby is gear, and we have lots, and astrophotographers, as much as people who just do observing, have a ton of gear. I know as an observer, I've got a briefcase full of eyepieces, and as a photographer, I've got boxes and of all kinds of different things, and adapters and filters and cables, and you name it. We've got it in our arsenal, and we have backups for everything. But do you have a favorite piece of gear that you have?
Well, I think favorite is plural in my case.
Okay.
I have, as you noted, a ton of stuff. But I have, my favorite things are cameras. It's probably my first love. And I have a variety of cameras that shoot everything from normal visual spectrum and to I've converted two of my cameras, a Nikon D6 Z6 rather, it's a mirrorless camera. I converted to a hydrogen alpha, and I converted another Nikon DSLR, huge, I think 36 megapixel to full spectrum. And I have more than three, so putting it out there. But those are my favorite things my favorite gadgets. And
Right.
then from there, I attach it to my telescopes. I use mostly wide angle lenses for my astro landscapes, like the image behind me. And probably my favorite lens, bar none, is a 14 to 24 millimeter lens. And that's what I shoot all of my Milky Way images. And it's an addiction.
Yeah.
Some,
Now, on a lot of your, especially the Milky Way stuff, are you tracking with that?
no, I do have tracking gear. No surprise, different flavors of tracking gear, but there are nothing that you ever seen or that's on my website is tracked.
Wow. So they're all relatively short exposures, and you're stacking a lot of images.
I'm stacking for my astro landscapes. Most of them are single frames.
Wow.
If you look at my deep space images, like I have images of Andromeda. I have images of the comet Neowise from a couple of years ago. Those are stacked. I have images of the Orion Nebula. Those were taken. Most of them were taken with a camera with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Only one I shot with a telescope. I have a Takahashi refractor that I connected to my Nikon D780, and I got a really nice image. It's stacked, but I got a really nice image of the Orion Nebula. But for the comet, I just used very short exposures. There's 300 images stacked, and it really came out nice and sharp, and you can even see the second tail on it. And this was just mounted on a tripod, and let the camera do its thing, and then post-processing.
That's so. Do you use any dedicated astronomy cameras or just the DSLRs?
Just the DSLRs. I do have a ZWO camera that I bought with the hopes of doing planetary imaging with my other telescope. During COVID, that's when I really dove back into astronomy. I had gotten away from it for many, many, many years, and I ended up buying two telescopes during COVID. Some people bought air fryers. I bought telescopes. So I bought a very old Meade 10-inch Schmidt, and I bought a Takahashi refractor. So the goal was to use the ZWO camera on the Meade,
Right,
and the difficulty with that is it's such a heavy telescope. I need help in order to get it out and set it up because I can't do it by myself.
right.
So at some point I'll get that going, but for the most part, it's just every image that I've shot so far is just with my cameras, either with just a regular camera lens or with the Takahashi.
My heavy rig is the C8. Um, and I have a guide scope on it. I have the ASI Air on it, and I've got all kinds of crazy things on the back. But what I do is I have these casters, which I actually have one right here on my desk, and I got 4 of these for 20 bucks on Amazon. And I put one under each tripod leg, and I can roll it in and out of the garage, no problem. I roll it to where I'm going to set up in the driveway, and then one by one, I just lift the leg a little bit and pop the caster out. I turn it upside down and put it on the ground, and I do that to the 3 legs. And then when I'm done, it takes, once I stop imaging, I can be packed up and in the house in less than 15 minutes usually.
Wow.
And I just keep everything set up. You know, uh, Occasionally, I'll switch out. I'll go from the C8 to my wide field rig, which is a 135 millimeter Samyang lens, which I just adore. Um,
I have that lens.
oh, that's a phenomenal, phenomenal lens. And I've done a lot of work with the Canon Nifty 50 lens, the 50 millimeter f1.8, I think. Um, and I haven't used that with a dedicated camera, but I've used it with a Canon DSLR, and I had nice results. Untracked stuff. I didn't do anything tracked with it, but I got some, and I know you've seen some of the shots, the Cygnus ones that I've done, and I've done some ones that show basically the whole constellation of Orion. Uh, and while I was happy with those results, for me, I wanted more. Um, and one of the things, I guess I'm not patient enough to do, thousands and thousands of images to stack like that. So tracking became a necessity for me. But just a thought on that maybe something, I don't know where you set up or how you set up, but something with something similar to these casters might work well for you, so you can use that scope on a more regular basis.
That's a
Just
great idea. You need to send me the link
sure.
to
Yeah,
those. That would be
yeah.
helpful.
I will do that. Well, and it's funny because here we are, we're helping each other out again. You told me about some fantastic tools, and this is a great transition um, to the next question, which is about resources. But you told me about uh, there's 2 tools that I use practically every one I use daily, and the other one I use pretty much whenever I do image processing. Um, there was the suite of software from Topaz.
Hmm.
which is spectacular. And I'm going to share my screen for a second. So here's you're very familiar with this program. This is Topaz Denoise.
Yep.
And I don't know how well this is going to show in the video, but as I move the slider over, you can see the denoised version as compared to the original version. And especially in the areas where the nebula is, it's so blotchy. And I mean, this is 125 frames stacked. And I would think that that noise would really start to go away, but I think part of it, I may need to do some tweaking with my gain settings and some other things. And I think because I'm shooting through a tremendous amount of light pollution, that's a factor as well. But it's a great tool. But the other tool that you've told me about, which I use every day, is Mobile Observatory Pro or Mobile Observatory. There's the Pro and the standard version. So Mobile Observatory, which is a free utility that you had told me about quite some time ago. So Mobile Observatory has been a tremendous help. I use it all the time just to see where things are going to be in the sky. And when I'm imaging the planets, it's great. So I know what moons I'm looking at on Jupiter or Saturn. And there's so many other things in there about the moon and about eclipses. It's just an amazing tool. But tell me about some of the things that you use as far as resources.
The tool that you just mentioned, actually the two tools that you mentioned, I heavily rely on apps. It's great that the period of time that we're living in, bad in other ways, but good in terms of apps and technology. I use Mobile Observatory Pro. I actually purchased the full-blown application, even though you can get the free version and it does so much. I use Astrospheric, which is a cloud forecasting app. That app gets better and better all the time, and they're up to 4 models now for prediction for cloud cover.
Hmm.
Is the free version, and you can also subscribe for like 99 cents a month, and you end up with 4 models. It uses the Canadian Meteorological Forecast for cloud cover, which is actually a forecast module that was written by Alan Rahill, who's a meteorologist, but he's an amateur astronomer, and he created this cloud forecasting tool that helps us determine the clarity of skies. In addition to that, Astrospheric added the North American model, the European model, and they've recently added cloud cover model that you can actually see real-time cloud cover in any area, which is very helpful for somebody like me that's going to be driving an hour and a half, 2 hours in order to get to a dark sky location. Another great tool that I use is Clear Outside, which is a simplistic tool. It just uses the Canadian model, but it is also very helpful because I use the two of them and I compare. And it's a statistical approach to determining whether or not you're going to go out or not. Another tool that I use heavily is Stellarium for people with telescopes. It's a well-known tool, but I've been using Stellarium for a long, long time, and it's a huge benefit for photographers that do astro landscape photography as well. I use a couple of other tools. I use Planet Pro, which is kind of like the underdog, or rather not as well known as PhotoPills. PhotoPills gives you a lot of information regarding planning. It's a planning tool to determine location of moon rises, Milky Way rises in relation to a foreground object. And this tool is PhotoPills on steroids. It's incredibly powerful, and I use that heavily for my planning tools. I use PhotoPills as well, but not as much as Planet Pro. And those are really my heavy use tools. And this is the things that I teach as well in my workshops for people that want to learn how to do this and how to plan for this type of photography.
I didn't know that you did workshops. That's really interesting. Can you tell me more about that?
I teach Milky Way photography because people, when you think about photography, you think of, pretty landscapes, pretty flowers. You don't think about nighttime and you don't think about infrared as well. I do a lot of infrared photography as well. I'm just fascinated by the things that we can't see. So nighttime. I love infrared because it shows us things that we can't see, but other creatures that live with us, like bugs and some birds, are able to see way past the visible spectrum. So I teach workshops in infrared, Milky Way photography, and also time lapse. That's another thing that I'm pretty fascinated with.
Yeah, the time lapse thing, that some of the time lapse stuff, I know you've posted some amazing videos of time lapse. There was one you just did with the moonrise over this lighthouse. I watched this a couple of days ago, probably not long after you posted it, and I was blown away. I just thought it was the coolest thing. You captured, I think most of the people there aren't paying attention to the moon. Um, and to me, that I don't know why you wouldn't, but to normal people, I guess that's, that they're oblivious to it. It's not something that they think about. And there's just such beauty in it. There was another here. It's the beaver tail one. This one is spectacular. So I love this, and you've obviously done some kind of manipulation to the image. But the artistry in this is just stunning, and the motion, it's just a really stunning. Can you tell me about how you put this video together?
Sure. Um, might recognize the location as the same place as where I shot the Falcon 9. So I went back another night. I wanted to do a time lapse, and time lapse is a funny thing. You can be as fancy as you want with gear, and as you noted, everything is heavily gear oriented in both astronomy and photography. You can create a time lapse with just having your camera on a tripod and fire at least 300 frames, and you can create a time lapse. That particular one, I had it on a panning head, so the camera was being fired by, I have a syrup genie. It's a pretty hefty device, and I can program it to fire a frame and trigger my camera's shutter every 10 seconds or whatever long duration I want. And that particular time lapse is comprised of about almost 800 images,
Wow.
and I put them all together. So what happens is the panning device is actually turning the camera and firing, and and until you got to where I decided to stop the camera from moving forward. And then I did pre-processing to the images because I shoot raw, and just like the film dark room, the digital dark room, you have to touch every print. You have to touch every negative. So you have to process each frame. And then what I did was I created the time lapse on that. And I thought it was cool, but sometimes light bulbs go off in my head. They're rare, but they do happen. And I ended up going through Topaz again, because Topaz has a huge suite of tools, and I applied kind of like a painterly type of effect on each frame, and then created another time lapse and ended up with that.
Wow. Yeah, it's really beautiful. It's a stunning image, and you capture the feel of what it is, but you put such an artistic touch on it. It's really lovely. And so thank you for doing that and sharing it. I
Thank
think
you.
it's an amazing project, and it really is stunning. Um, so getting back to uh, oh, okay, resources. Oh, your future endeavors in the hobby.
the it changes day to day. And it most of the time it's like, okay, what can make my obsession easier to accomplish? And I'm always looking out for new tools. And my number one goal at this point is to perhaps handle my big rig of my 10-inch Schmidt, and put that to work, and have put my computer to work, set it up that I can access my telescope and my ZWO little camera remotely, and do some planetary imaging.
Nice.
That's right now is my goal, and I think I might be able to do it sooner than later, given the little gadget that you recommended.
Yeah, and I will email you that afterwards. But um, so, which CWO camera do you have?
I think it's a color one, and I think it's the 240 or 260. I can't remember the
Okay.
number.
Yeah, yeah. I use the 462 for my my planetary work, and it's nice because it's very sensitive in the infrared. So I actually have to put an infrared blocking filter on it because it's so sensitive to it. But it's great as a guide camera because it's so sensitive in the infrared. It's picking up a lot of fainter stars that it can guide from. But the problem when I don't have the blocking filter on there is that the stars are bloated.
Yeah.
So sometimes the guiding is actually worse. And I experienced that the other night. On one side of the pier, the guiding was horrible. And once I flipped to the other side of the pier, guiding was spot on.
Hmm.
So it's a tricky little hobby that we have. But one of the things that I wanted to uh, just kind of maybe you can dive into some real detail here. But if somebody was starting out and wanted to get involved with this nightscape photography, what would they need to do? How do they go about it?
Well, if you have a camera that's been, the fairly recent DSLR or mirrorless camera made within the past, I'd say, 5 years. Those cameras are very sensitive to night. And if you have an intervalometer, or your camera's able to trigger shots internally, so they have a built-in intervalometer, and you need a, a solid tripod. A solid tripod is key for this type of photography. Um, you are really good to go. You're able to start shooting with just three basic things. If you have an older camera than 5 years, I would recommend, if you really get into this craft, I highly recommend investing in a better camera. Older cameras are very noisy, so even if you stack the images, you'll still have hot pixels, and yes, you can mitigate that with tools, but you end up with cleaner images with a better sensor. So if you have a good sensor, sky's the limit, no pun intended. You can do amazing things with a mirrorless or DSLR with a good sensor. Um, and you can shoot deep sky images, deep sky objects. You can shoot things like what's behind me. And the night is magnificent. There is so much color, and these sensors are so good that they can capture an incredible amount of light, even though to your eye it's dark. Um, your camera can see so much.
Yeah, the human eye is very efficient under low light conditions, and I'm guessing it's evolutionary. Once we developed fire and we didn't have the need to have great vision at night, um, and uh, the way that our eyes work, the rod cells and the cone cells, and I always forget which one's which. I think the cone cells are the color receptors. Um, but one of them is very sensitive to color and one's not. And at nighttime, the color sensitive cells don't work real well. So that's why, you know, at night things do seem almost, especially very faint light, as monochrome to us because we don't get that color. Our eyes just can't detect it. Um, and you're right, the camera, it's not a human eye. It's designed to see light. And it's funny when I first got into astrophotography again, uh, because I had gotten away from it for a very long time, and 2 or 3 years ago I got back into it. But I picked up a DSLR. It was a used Canon D60, which is probably a 10-year-old camera, but it had been modified for H-alpha. So by having that, I was able to get some pretty good shots. Noise is clearly an issue. I think with any camera, uh, with low light, noise is an issue. Um,
To a degree.
yeah, yeah. But there's ways to deal with it and
Hmm.
and ways to mitigate it. And the image that's behind me right now, that's I think that's about 4.5 hours of total exposure time. And I used a mix of 1, 2, and 3 minute exposures, I believe, for this one. Um, so I was able to get it pretty noise free, not 100%, but I did some very light touch up with topaz, and that cleaned it up quite a bit without losing really much of the detail, because there's some pretty fine details. And that's the good and the bad thing with the programs that uh, like a Topaz with the denoise, it gets rid of noise, but at the same time you're losing some detail.
Yeah, it's a catch-22. And the thing about noise is random. So the more you can stack images, the more you can mitigate noise because each frame, because noise is random, you're filling up the potholes of the image below it. So the more frames you have, the cleaner your image can be. So uh, Topaz is phenomenal for removing noise, and its low light feature is fantastic because it can understand that this is something that you photographed in low light, meaning the night sky, and it won't take a sledgehammer approach to how it mitigates noise. It won't look at a star and say, "Oh, that's noise. I got to get rid of that." So it has a gentler hand, but noise is noise, and there are many ways to mitigate it with software, with stacking, and with better sensors. Right now, I am digging into the invariance of sensors, which means that at a particular ISO, even if you increase the exposure in post-processing, it won't introduce noise. So you can achieve a very clean image at low ISO versus shooting at higher ISO, which gives you less dynamic range and you end up with more noise. So not all sensors have this capability, but I am testing out the gear that I have for the invariance capability that these sensors have, and it's pretty fascinating to what I've discovered so far. It's actually wild. But sensors are wild. They're they're an addiction.
They it's funny because I mean, I know one of the things that I do, I have a dedicated astronomy camera that I use that's cooled. And they say that the cooling helps a lot with noise. And so I shoot most of my stuff. I've been doing it at minus 10 degrees Celsius, between 0 and minus 10. It hasn't been cool enough for me to cool much further than that. I one night I did some dark frames at minus 15, but I'm curious to see what's going to happen, what the noise level difference is going to be when I get down to minus 25 C compared to minus 10 C. But I don't know.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is, a lot of this information is not documented, so it's trial and error. And you might, excuse me, pick up on some theory somewhere, and you'll go, and you start digging on your own. And sensors are a funny thing that one sensor could have more heat issues than other sensors. Um, And I've experienced this on the field. I'll be out shooting either with people in my workshop or with friends that shoot various different brands of cameras, and we'll shoot the same scene, same ambient temperature, and you'll end up with a different amount of noise, and that's contingent upon the sensor that's being used in the individual cameras. Some cameras are notorious for heat issues, especially the older sensors. That's why I recommend, if you get into night photography, um, the newer sensors don't have as much issue with heat as the older sensors did. So you end up with less pixel noises and overall noise in general, and color casts and all that happy stuff.
Yeah, no, that's very good advice. And I think on a personal note, I probably would have done it a little different. Although I was working on a budget, so I went with what I could afford.
That's the
And
key.
yeah, and unfortunately, with the budget I was working with, it was the Canon D60, and I think I picked it up. I got it used. I think it was 400 bucks on cloudy nights, and it was a great deal, and it's a great camera. I mean, I've gotten some very nice images with it, but now it's sitting in a box and it doesn't get used, so I want to sell it and sell off a lot of the lenses and all the other I have filters, I have all kinds of things for it. I'd like to sell that, and my thing is, I don't buy equipment new just to buy equipment new. I sell off old stuff and then I buy new stuff.
I try to do that. Yeah, it doesn't work too well for my cameras, but I've done it for other stuff. But yeah, I agree. But for that kit, I mean, that's a very well-known camera for deep space photography. So it's a great camera for someone that's just starting out
Yes.
on photography, like deep space photography. That H alpha conversion on that camera is very good, and it's a good place for people to get in onto the craft on the cheap.
Yeah.
So if you someone on a low budget, um, go for it. That's a good place to start. And then from there, depending on your passion, if you really get into it, then you start realize I want more, and that's where cha-ching comes in.
Yeah. What I like about ZWO is their equipment is very reliable, it's solid, and for the most part, it's not terribly expensive. Um, there's really good color cameras, and even monochrome cameras under $1,000. And their planetary cameras are a steal. The planetary camera I have, I think sells for $250, and it's a great camera. I use it all the time. Uh, yeah, and there's other companies out there as well. I'm kind of tied into ZWO because I use the ASI Air to control my mount and the guide scope and the cameras and everything else. So having one, not having to have to lug a laptop out there and deal with, you know, the difficulties you can have by having a laptop outside when it's dewy and cold and damp. Uh, but having a piece of gear that is designed to be out in that's tiny, doesn't take up space, doesn't create any light pollution. It's been such a boon to help uh, my what's the word? My voyage, not voyage, that's not the right word. My
Journey.
my, my journey into astrophotography. And it's funny when I look back at images I did even a year ago, the improvement that I've had in that time blows me away. Technology has made the hobby so much more accessible to everybody. And I think just having an appreciation for the night sky is so important because it's such a huge part of who we are as human beings and as earthlings that, uh, knowing, uh, having an appreciation for the sky and our place in the universe uh, kind of makes a lot of the stupid things that go on here a lot less stupid because you can put them in perspective. But I don't get political on this channel. and I'm not going to go beyond that. But I think that if more people got an understanding of where we are and what our place is, and in the grand scheme of things, we'd have a much more peaceful world to live in.
I agree with that, Wayne, 100%. I think observing the sky, observing and understanding that we are just less of a speck in the overall scheme of things is a um, very humbling thing. And being humble in life produces a lot less friction, and it could be applied everywhere. So I think people, if they become more cognizant of the reality of who we are and where we are on this little blue marble, I think it would be better for us all. But that's just my lowly perspective on things.
Uh, well, I think that kind of brings us to a good spot to bring this to a close. But before we do, I want to just again, if you could just talk a little bit about your workshops, how people can attend them, and your website. Just plug your stuff.
Thank you, Wayne. Well, as noted, my website is Silvana, my first name, Silvana, photo.com. This is my playground. This is where I get to show my images, and I print my stuff on everything. I heavily print on metal because I think metal just elevates an image. You can really appreciate the amount of color and beauty in the night sky. But I print calendars, I teach workshops, and I do them online during the winter months. In fact, I have one coming up in January on how to use one of my favorite planning apps, which is Planet Pro. And I will teach people that are interested how to actually use this tool and unleash its power. I teach infrared workshops, both in person and online. I teach how to shoot infrared, how to process infrared, which is a completely different animal on both ends of the spectrum, no pun intended. I talk about ultraviolet photography. That's pretty trippy in and of itself. I love to share knowledge, and I love seeing the ignition of fascination in people when they realize what they can do with the gear that they have. Nothing's more satisfying to me than people realizing that they can explore the night sky and capture it and really relish these moments than being able to teach it. So I do camera club judging as well, and I do camera club presentations, as well as, shoot events and so forth. But I do it all. As long as it's camera oriented, I'm a happy puppy.
Again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us and do this. I really appreciate it. I've been a fan of your work, and I look forward to seeing the great things you have coming. So I encourage everyone again, silvanaphoto.com, visit the website, and as we say here, seize the night, carpe noctem. Well, that was a tremendous amount of fun. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. It's always a pleasure to see Silvana's art, which really is a mix of science and art, and to learn from her and to get some great tips and techniques. So hopefully you've gleaned quite a bit from this episode. I know that I did. Just a reminder, if you have any questions or episode suggestions, you can always email us at astroguypodcast@gmail.com, or send a text or a voicemail at 973-404-0380. As always, seize the night. Carpe noctem. I'm Wayne Zool, and this was the Astro Guy Podcast. Thank you for listening. As always, your questions, comments, and suggestions are welcome. Keep wondering. Keep your eyes on the sky. Have fun. Carpe noctem. Seize the night.